Our Bible text is 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So 2 Corinthians, this is a letter that Paul wrote on his third missionary journey. And just to give again some brief background on 2 Corinthians, on his third missionary journey, Paul stayed in Ephesus for a period of about 2 to 3 years. And while he ministered there, he also made a visit to Corinth, an unannounced visit, but it was a disastrous visit because there he came and he was rejected by some. Some rejected his authority because Paul also wanted to deal with a sinful brother and his behavior, and they did not deal with it properly. So he went there also to address it, but some were not happy, and Paul left there embarrassed and humiliated. He returned to Ephesus. So there was now a very strained relationship with at least some of the Christians in Corinth. And another problem was also that there were rival apostles in Corinth. Who these apostles were, we do not know. But they were there and they accepted the patronage of the Corinthians. And apparently they had very good ability to speak. Their style of rhetoric was very good and accomplished. And they made fun of Paul and his speech and his stature, etc. And so they undermined Paul. But Paul was the one who established them. So these rival apostles arrived in Corinth and they got quite a following, and they undermined Paul's influence and his authority. So Paul also had to battle with that. And sometime in Asia, or while Paul was also traveling towards Macedonia, because it was in Macedonia where Paul wrote 2 Corinthians from, because he wrote in an attempt to reconcile, because he sent brothers to Corinth to build bridges, and he got good news when he arrived in Macedonia, that there can be reconciliation. So chapters 1 to 7 of 2 Corinthians is much about this reconciliation, because they also doubted his honesty, because Paul made travel plans and then changed it. So they also thought Paul's not very trustworthy, what he says. There are some, like I said, who say he's not such a good speaker. Is he really an apostle? Because Paul is like a latecomer to the scene. He wasn't an original follower of Jesus. And so this strained relationship, and to build on that, Paul also recently had a near-death experience while in Asia. We're not exactly sure what this near-death experience was, but he was kind of in a bad place personally. Also, in terms of relationship with the Corinthians, there's this attempt now to reconcile between him and the Corinthians, to build bridges, to come together again. He's the apostle. And much of 2 Corinthians 1 to 7 is about Paul explaining the nature of the apostle ministry. Like he says, it's a ministry that proclaims the glory of Christ, who is God's image, which is greater than that glory that Moses had when he received the 10 Commandments. Paul says the apostle ministry is the ministry of the new covenant. It's a ministry of the Spirit. It's a ministry of reconciliation, etc. But also a part of that is that it's a ministry of suffering. Because Paul the apostle is persecuted, and life's not easy for him. And he also describes to the Corinthians, it's like being this fragile clay vessel. But God uses these fragile clay vessels to spread the knowledge of Christ, and also the knowledge of Christ's suffering. But so Paul, he says, the life as an apostle, it's a life of suffering also. But through his suffering, he brings the message of the gospel to people. If we go to chapter 4, we can read there from verse 7, Paul writes, but we have this treasure, in other words, the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In other words, knowledge of Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. In verse 8 he says, we are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken, etc. Always carrying about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. So Paul also says, we are delivered over for death. As apostles, we are suffering, etc. But he says in verse 12, so then death is working in us, but life in you. So this ministry as an apostle is this life of suffering. And now if we look at our immediate textual unit, it's from chapter 4 verses 16 to 5 verses 10. That's where Paul writes about the hope for future glory, which essentially means like this hope for the resurrection body. And what Paul does here is something very similar to what we find in Romans, especially Romans chapter 8, where Paul speaks of life in the Spirit. But then Paul also speaks that we also look forward to this glory. If we suffer with Christ, we will also be revealed with him. And especially what he writes in chapter 8, verse 18. Paul writes, therefore, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So Paul also speaks there of suffering in the present, but the glory that will be revealed for Christians in the future. Of course, in 2 Corinthians, Paul specifically also is focusing on his own ministry as an apostle. Because, of course, he wants to build this bridge with the Corinthians. He wants to explain to them, I'm your apostle. I brought the message of Christ to you. Come, let's come together. I care for you. I love you. Don't be influenced by these other rival apostles who boast in the flesh, as he says, and make all other kinds of boastings about himself. So this is part of Paul. He wants to explain to them, this is my experience as the apostle ministry, bringing to you this knowledge of Christ. In the present, also, it's a life of suffering. But in the future, it will reveal glory. So that is what our textual unit is about. From chapter 4, verses 16 to 5, verse 10. If we go to chapter 4, verse 16, Paul writes, therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. And now Paul goes on to again speak about the affliction of the present. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So he's speaking of himself as an apostle, but also general Christian experience for those who are suffering. Present suffering in this frail body, the body of the flesh, versus the future glory, the glory of the resurrection body. So that's the focus of our present textual unit. So we can draw a contrast between the present life, this frail life, where there's suffering, where you're subject to death, being in this frail flesh and blood body, versus the future glory of the resurrection body. So we can make this future comparison. It's a present life of suffering. That's what Paul calls the external or the visible life, in contrast to the hope of future glory. That's the internal or the spiritual life that Paul compares in this textual unit. So if you look at chapter 4, verses 16 to 18, we can see that the comparison. The outward man is perishing. In other words, life in this frail flesh and blood body, as opposed to the inward man that is being renewed. In this present life, there's a momentary light affliction, as opposed to the eternal weight of glory that awaits us, all associated when we receive that resurrection body. The present life is temporary, and it's about the things that are seen, as opposed to the things that are not seen, that are eternal. Now, if we move over to chapter 5, Paul again makes this contrast. He speaks of this earthly body versus the future glorious resurrection body. Here, Paul appears to be speaking of what happens immediately at death, but he also looks what will happen beyond death. In other words, the future glorious life, the resurrection life. So he makes that contrast. So if we go to from chapter 5, verses 1 onwards, he speaks of our earthly body, our earthly house. He also speaks of it as a tent. In other words, it's temporary. It's like pitching a tent from place to place. But he also speaks if that tent is dismantled or destroyed, whatever. He says, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So Paul is saying, if we die, we do not have hope, or we're not hopeless, because in the heavens, somewhere there's this other special habitation that's waiting for us, this dwelling from God or building from God. He's speaking of the resurrection body. It's there waiting for us. But in a sense, also for Paul, we already kind of have the resurrection body because we are already united with Christ through baptism, through life in the Spirit. So in a way, this body is kind of there, but of course, it will only be fully revealed at the time Jesus returns, and there will be the resurrection of the dead and the transformation of the living, etc. But he says, beyond death, after death and beyond death, there's a special dwelling from God that waits for us, the resurrection body. He also makes further contrast. It says, we groan in this present body because we are desiring to be clothed with our habitation from heaven. Again, there's this further contrast. It's God who will give us this heavenly body, and it's a heavenly body, a spiritual body. Paul also makes the comparison that presently we are in a state of nakedness. And he speaks of us being clothed, that we shall not be found naked. Because humanity is in Adam, right? Sinful humanity. We are in Adam. And in a sense, we are naked, right? Adam and Eve discovered that they were naked. So it also refers to our sinful state. Life in this mortal flesh, sinful flesh, which Christ has also came to crucify, Paul writes in another place. So we want to be further clothed. We don't want to be found naked. In other words, we want to be found having this resurrection body, this dwelling that will come from God, this heavenly dwelling. Paul also speaks of this present life as a state of mortality, because if we are further clothed, in other words, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. We also find similar language here to what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, where he contrasts present life versus the resurrection life. Because it's about being perishable versus being imperishable, mortal versus being immortal. It's about having a certain kind of glory, having the heavenly glory. So we can also go read 1 Corinthians 15, how Paul contrasts present existence versus future existence via the resurrection body. He also writes that if we are at home in the body, that means to be absent from the Lord. But he also says we wish rather to be absent from the body, which means that we will be present with the Lord. Because now in this body, we walk by faith. And then if we have the resurrection body, we will walk by sight. So Paul contrasts this life in the present body and this future glory of the resurrection body and everything that comes with it. But then he also goes on, if we go to verse 9, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well pleasing to him. So Paul digresses a bit here. He's making this contrast about being in the body, out of the body, away from Christ, and being with Christ. But whether it's here in the body or away from the body, we want to be well pleasing to Christ. Right? We want to live according to the gospel. And now we come to our Bible text. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So life in this body is important. We want to be pleasing to Christ. The same is true also after death. We want to be pleasing. And of course, Paul is also speaking specifically here of and having that glorious resurrection body. But also importantly is, even as Christians, we will be judged based on how we've conducted our lives. And it will be a summary of our life that will be judged, whether it's good or bad. And Paul uses the imagery here of a judgment seat, in Greek the bema. And a bema refers to a special place of judgment, where a judge will sit. It's a judicial place, and it can refer to a seat, or it can refer to a platform on which a seat is placed. Today, if you go to Corinth, you will still see the bema there. It's a platform. So Paul probably has this imagery in mind, because the Corinthians would have been familiar with this bema, because there the Roman judge would have sat in judgment, etc., and where he would make judicial findings. It's a tribunal. So Paul is saying we will all appear before the tribunal, this judgment seat of Christ. So he will judge us according to our works in the body. So Paul is here, he's contrasting our present life, our tent, our earthly tent. It's not permanent, it's fragile, weak, it's mortal, it's being in a state of nakedness, versus the future glory that we hope for, the resurrection body that's immortal. Like it says, we want to be further clothed. We want to put on this resurrection body so it can swallow up our nakedness or our present existence, etc., to be transformed into Christ's image. And what's also important is life in the body, or even away from the body, when we will have, whether it be life after death or the future resurrection, how Paul brings it all together, so that Christ will judge us based on what we have done in the body.